from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to today's program. We're welcoming to the program today a spokesperson for the John Birch Society. He is on tour, I believe, around the United States speaking on a number of subjects. Our guest is William Norman Gregg, who was born in the state of Idaho and educated at Ricks College and Utah State University. While studying at the National Journalism Center in Washington, D.C., he worked as a research assistant to Fred Barnes, who's well known as a TV commentator on some programs, and who has also been the White House correspondent for the New Republic magazine. Mr. Gregg also has worked on the staff of the National Right to Life Committee, and at one time also wrote a column for the Provo Daily Herald, which is in Provo, Utah. Our guest has written 2 books. His first book was entitled The Gospel of Revolt, Feminism versus the Family, which was published in 1993. On today's program, we'll spend a lot of our time on his most recent book, which I shall show you, called Freedom on the Altar. It is a critique and criticism of the United Nations. In fact, the subtitle is The United Nations Crusade Against God and Family, which I have a copy. Mr. Gregg, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much.
We always have the opportunity to interview people traveling around the country on different subjects, and the John Birch Society is one organization that from time to time sends a guest to our program.
We're grateful for the opportunity.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Janelle will commence today's question with our guest.
Well, I would like to ask you a 2-pronged question today. The first prong being, how did you become interested in the John Birch Society? And then the second prong being, what is your position with regard to the family? I know the family is your special area of interest and expertise within the John Birch Society, and can you kind of tell us how you became interested in the society
Certainly.
and what your position is?
Well, those 2 questions are quite complementary. And with respect to the first prong of your question, I became involved in the John Birch Society primarily because of the John Birch Society's opposition to the Persian Gulf War. I had gone to Washington in 1987 and 1988 as a reflexive anti-communist, and of course I retained my opposition to communism. As a result of my experience in Washington, D.C., I came back considerably more conservative than I had been when I went, because I had seen the products of arrogant and abusive and presumptuous government. That led me, I should say, to an investigation of some of the fundaments of politics. I began to look at the way in which government grows and the effect the government has on institutions which I cherish, primarily, of course, the family. And in 1990, as we began to have the countdown, or the build-up to the Persian Gulf War, I saw our country being led into a war that had nothing to do with our national interests, one that seemed to have nothing to do with any interest that would be intellectually or morally defensible. And the John Birch Society, unlike most other conservative organizations, took a position rooted in principle in opposition to a war that turned out to be an illegal war in the sense it wasn't declared by Congress as our Constitution mandates, and it was a war which was fought to augment the prestige and power of the United Nations. I remember upon hearing George Bush's now infamous New World Order speech in 1990, I called a friend of mine of the John Birch Society and said, it would appear that you fellows have been right. And in the process of time, I started to write for the New American magazine and came to work for the John Birch Society in 1993. As to our perspective on the family is that it is an institution which transcends politics. It is the most basic social institution, the primary source of our values, the primary source of social organization, and that there is an eternal rivalry between the family and the state, because inasmuch as the state expands, it usurps to itself functions which the family should serve. And in order to expand, the state must of necessity corrupt and subvert the family. And for that reason, since time immemorial, you've had this conflict between the state and the family, and in that conflict we come down on the side of the conventional family, defined in every culture of which we have record as an organization which is organized around a man and a woman in a lawful and committed marital relationship. And that is, in a nutshell, our perspective on the family.
So I think you just gave me the definition, but will you give our viewers again your definition of
certainly.
what a family is?
The family is a social organization which is organized around the nucleus of a man and a woman who are joined in lawful and committed matrimonial relationship.
Does that definition of family transcend just national borders? Would you say that that's the international as well, the international definition as well?
I would say that in any culture in the world, you will find a family organized in that sense. You have extended families. In some cultures today, you still have polygamous families, but they're all organized around that basic nucleus. They're all elaborations upon the basic design.
Mr. Gregg, before we started the program, I told you that I had read your book, the one called Freedom on the Altar, and in the format that I proposed today, which we both said would be fine, I would like to quote in my times some passages from your book and make a reaction to that, and then obviously have you respond.
Certainly.
On the first passage was on page 2 of the book, in which you were talking about the Middle East and the conflict that took place there in the early 1990s, and you said, I quote, "Although Americans are justifiably proud of the valor and skill of the American troops who fought in the 1991 Gulf War, it must not be forgotten that the armed conflict with Saddam Hussein's forces was fought to empower the United Nations, not to protect American interests. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the Americans who perished in that war should be numbered among the UN's victims." You go on to say in another passage, "The only real winners in the Gulf War were the curiously indestructible dictator Saddam Hussein and the United Nations." Mm-hmm. One other passage, before I comment and get your response, was on page 25 and 26 of your book, in which you were critical of former President George Bush, in which you said, "Nevertheless, the United Nations way of thinking," in quotes, "was emphatically endorsed by President Bush during a speech before the United Nations General Assembly on September 23, 1991, end of quote. A little later, I'm also going to quote your criticism of President Clinton. But in relation to those passages, may I take just a moment to say mm-hmm. that from one perspective that some of us have observed, it could certainly be argued very effectively that President George Bush was masterful in his success of using the United Nations to rally not only the Western countries of Europe, but most of the Arab world and Israel. Many of us believe that Saddam Hussein was intent upon taking all the Middle East. He was in Kuwait, and then he was going into possibly Saudi mm-hmm. Arabia, mm-hmm. and that he has the same characteristics of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. And so I would take the position for you to respond to that George Bush was remarkable in putting together a coalition somewhat similar in some ways to World War II, when he was able, through the United Nations, to bring the Arab world and Israel, which was very difficult, mm-hmm. and Europe together to stop Saddam Hussein and force him to leave Kuwait. Do you find this statement that I make of validity as to, in other words, it's a challenge to the level of criticism that you mm-hmm. directed at President Bush? Mm-hmm.
Well, I would take issue with that characterization, as you probably could predict, yeah. on a couple of accounts. First of all, it was possible to stop Saddam Hussein at an earlier juncture without loss of life. If we had warned him off before he had invaded Kuwait, as we had an opportunity to do, we would not have found it necessary, quote unquote necessary, to engage in a horrendous and hideous conflict in which hundreds of thousands of civilians and Iraqi conscripts died, in which hundreds of Americans died. In that sense, we could have prevented that conflict without having it escalate into the war that we had. Secondly, the parallel with Adolf Hitler breaks down because, unlike Adolf Hitler, who emptied his diseased head in a bunker, Saddam Hussein is still in power in Iraq, because apparently the mandate of the United Nations did not extend to the removal of the problem, nor did it extend to protecting the Kurds, who were the innocent victims of Saddam Hussein. That's why I said in my description that he's curiously indestructible. For somebody who was supposedly representing a menace of the magnitude of Adolf Hitler, there was a great deal of solicitude, if you will, for the welfare of Saddam Hussein in this conflict. I don't contend that Saddam Hussein was anything other than a monster. Of course he's monstrous. He's vile and he's a megalomaniacal dictator. I agree with that altogether. It's just I don't happen to agree that he presented a menace to the entire world. I believe that his menace could have been halted at an earlier juncture without the loss of life we had. And beyond that, I don't believe that you can argue from efficiency if you don't agree with the moral objective of an undertaking. The fact that George Bush was successful in bringing together this coalition begs the question of the purpose to which that coalition was put, and I still think that purpose had nothing to do with American interests. or with a morally sustainable objective.
Let me take this a step further.
Sure.
And let me suggest to you that Saddam Hussein is like other dictators, that negotiating with him is not a success, and he's not a person of his word.
Oh, I agree with that altogether.
Yes. And therefore, sometimes without some kind of force, you do not get the attention of a dictator. Let me give an example. There was really strong evidence, both from the United States and from the United Nations, that Saddam Hussein was preparing and manufacturing, moving towards nuclear weapons, which would create a totally different problem. And one of the things that the Bush administration did, and I must add that the Clinton administration has also done, has worked very diligently and with it clear that force could even be involved to make sure that does not happen. And a similar situation in Iran, some years ago when Israel intervened.
Actually, it was in Iraq as well.
Yes.
That they intervened the Osiris reactor. Yeah.
Yes. So I would argue for the position that those administrations, Bush and Clinton, should have some credit for stopping that movement towards nuclear weapons.
Well, if we're going to get involved in the suppression of nuclear technology, we're going to move in a direction which the UN has been pursuing for about 30 years, which is the idea essentially not of doing away altogether with nuclear weapons, but rather having a nuclear monopoly under the direction of the United Nations. And I would not take comfort in that prospect, because he who controls the guns controls the world. That's part of our larger objection to world government. But with respect to the question of the nuclear threat, the duty of a president of the United States is not to act on behalf of the world community. It is to act on behalf of the United States of America. We could defend America against a nuclear threat by some means other than involving ourselves in an unconstitutional war under the color of UN authority. There are ways that we could provide for the defense of America against rogue states by using missile defense systems that would not entail entangling ourselves in UN objectives and fighting wars which have no constitutional sanction. That's the way I would respond to that.
I wish I could pursue further, but I must go back to Janelle Birch and let her have some time.
I want to go further with regard to the United Nations and their position about the family. It seems to me that with regard to the United Nations, there must be some points that you pick out that are specific, that you object to, that is, programs that are specific that you object to. What are some of those programs?
Well, my most vehement objections center in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Not because I'm opposed to the rights of children, but because I'm opposed to the concept of children's rights, which the UN represents, or which the UN pursues, rather, through that convention. I had the opportunity recently, while I was in Copenhagen at the World Summit on Social Development, to speak with the acting director of UNICEF, who at the time was Richard Jolly. And in a conversation I had with him, he confirmed to me that the Convention on the Rights of the Child would enshrine in law the concept that it is the government which is the primary custodian of children's rights and their well-being. This is a concept which is foreign to Americans' constitutional traditions. Under the American concept, which prevailed at the time of the writing of our Constitution, the family is the primary custodian of children's rights and well-being. This is an investiture of authority they receive from God and not from the state. It has to do with the question of where do our rights come from, and the UN comes down on behalf of the proposition that rights are created by the state to fill purposes served by the state. And furthermore, Article 9 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child would empower the state to seize summarily from parents that the state finds incompetent children, which would then be raised according to the dictates of the state. Now, this is something with which we violently disagree, not to put too fine a point on the observation. So that would be, as I said, the center of my most vehement objections. Secondly, and very briefly, in the International Year of the Family, which was conducted in 1994 and which recently concluded in a conference in Salt Lake City, of all the apparently unlikely places, the purpose of the family, according to the documents of the International Year of the Family, was identified as carrying out sustainable development. Now, sustainable development is a catchword, a buzzword, if you will, catchphrase, that the UN uses to signify an environmental regime in which all of our activities would be regulated by the UN in the interest of preserving the environment as they reckon environmental necessities would exist. I contend that the purpose of the family is to raise people and prepare them for a life in freedom, and not to carry out objectives which are ordained by the United Nations. And that's, of course, another very serious and strenuous point of disagreement that we have with the UN.
In terms of the UN, would you agree, though, that children should not be mistreated? I take it that you have no problem with that. I don't see how any
humane person could disagree with that proposition. But that is not, in practice, the position of the United Nations. The United Nations has had no problem underwriting and supporting hideous policies in places like communist China, in which you have state-sanctioned and state-executed infanticide of so-called unauthorized children. China's one-child policy received an award from the United Nations in 1983. It was commended to the world as an example of how to achieve sustainable development. It's been underwritten by the UN Development Program, by UNICEF, by the UN Fund for Population Activities. This is what the UN represents in terms of its perspective on the family, unfortunately, and this is something that people should understand.
How would you protect children then?
Well, children should be protected by restoring, I contend, the autonomy of families. I would defer to John Locke's insight that parents were given the role of raising children by God. They're accountable to God for that role, and they're also accountable, of course, to the state for obeying the laws of the land. But the primary source of the well-being and education of children has to be the family. And of course, where you have culpable and certifiable and demonstrable mistreatment, of course, there are sanctions of the law that would be enforced. But you should restore the primacy of parental authority in the home, I contend, and unfortunately we're living in a society in which that role of the parents is being eroded and undermined with startling alacrity.
Would you, if you had your way, do away with UNICEF?
Yes, I would.
Eliminate UNICEF?
Well,
totally.
I do away with the United Nations altogether, so.
So that'd be, but basically then in terms of providing for, because I know that UNICEF does provide for in some instances supplies, food, care, clothing for children, other places in the world. But how would you?
Well, there is a whole host of very commendable organizations that have found themselves harnessed to the UN, if you will. Private organizations, religious organizations, volunteer organizations, they're now called PVAs, private voluntary associations. They do wonderful work, and as a religious person, I consider it godly work of providing for children who are in need and families who are confronting material hardship. They do wonderful work, and they do not of necessity need the involvement of the United Nations. In fact, some of my acquaintances who were involved in this kind of work say that their efforts are hampered by the UN because the UN insists on brokering all these actions in making sure that these actions meet the priorities of the United Nations, which is unfortunate. The people who are involved in disinterested charity work around the world, I think, are the best example of what humanity is capable of doing without the intervention of government.
Let's move to some other sections of your
Sure.
book, Freedom on the Altar. On page 214 of your book, you have very strong language for President Clinton. You take the presidents, particularly President Bush and President Clinton, and you're very critical. You say, and I quote, "The Clinton administration, a dismal collection of power-intoxicated socialists," rather strong language, "who literally defy parity, has provided a constant supply of outrages to freedom." You go on to say it's craven embrace of UN-directed multilateralism. It's obvious that you think that both administrations have this commitment to the United Nations that you disagree with. And I would go also to page 79, in which, in a more mild way, you criticize William J. Bennett, who's one of the more prominent conservative intellectual spokespersons in the country. And again, in relation to Janelle's question, you were critical of both Mr. Bennett and President Bush, because you thought that, from what I read from your book, that they were giving consideration to some changes in relation between parents and children.
Yes.
But you also recognized that it had to do with drug-related cases. So my question, or the involved one, is, again, coming from a different perspective, I would suggest for your response the comment that William Bennett and President Clinton and others have been very concerned about problems in the world, and not only has President Clinton, like President Bush, tried to bring to a halt some atrocities around the world, but in this case, President Bush and Mr. Bennett were concerned about what happens to children. I guess my bottom line question would be either about children or a country. When a parent abuses a child very badly, or a country becomes aggressive toward their neighbors, is it not the role of the United Nations and the United States, both in domestic legislation and internationally, to address those atrocities?
Are you asking if there would be a role for the United Nations with respect to domestic affairs
No,
of this
I have
country?
two different questions
okay,
here.
two different questions.
But there is an analogy here.
Yeah.
That is, if the United States finds that a child's being abused in a family seriously, the laws are such that there's responsibility to protect that child, i.e., another
because
example,
of the abdication of parental authority.
Yes. In the same way with the United Nations, and again what President Bush did in the Middle East, and that is when a nation is acting in an abusive way, like a parent might be, then an international, which is a different issue, it would also respond to that problem.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's a different issue. And I would address the second question first with respect to Bill Bennett's suggestion regarding changes in the relationship between parents and children. I don't think that's a federal issue. I don't see how you could construe a federal interest in a question of a child that's being abused. It's a question, I think, which would be best dealt with through the principle of subsidiarity, and I think as a Roman Catholic, William Bennett would appreciate and understand the concept, namely that you handle problems at the lowest amenable level of government. If a parent is abusing a child, you have to stop the abuse. But who is the you in this equation that would stop the abuse? It would be somebody who knows and understands the needs of that family. It would be somebody perhaps who is a neighbor, a co-religionist, or a member of a private voluntary or association of some sort that knows the parents of the family, knows the family's needs, and can address them. I think that's the best way to handle that problem. With respect to your question regarding abuses which are committed by governments, once again, the Constitution does not confer upon any president of the United States a mandate or a responsibility for making peace in the world. It confers upon a president, and as commander-in-chief of the military in time of war, the sole power and privilege of protecting American property and rights and interests. If abuses are committed by a foreign government that threaten American rights, properties, and interests, then the president has a calling and a constitutional obligation to act. Apart from that, he has no power to do so. And he's acting in a criminal fashion if he transcends his political authority, which is allocated to him by the Constitution.
Let me see if I'm reading this correctly. If there was, as there was with Hitler, and there are others, there is Saddam Hussein we've talked about, and Gaddafi in Libya and other places. If a dictator, an aggressive individual country, chose to effect the property and lives of other countries, but left us alone and continue to be successful from country to country, do you believe that our position should be to stay out of that until and if that we were involved? I guess what I'm trying, the bottom line is they could have so much of the world under their control that we would be probably in danger of losing our freedom if we waited that long. World War II is a good example.
Well, with respect to World War II, Hitler solved that problem for us by declaring war on us, if you'll recall.
But if he had not, should we have intervened?
If he had not, I don't think we should have intervened, quite frankly, until and unless such time he attacked something that was recognizable as an American interest. Constitutional law is a rigid discipline, and of course we would have been involved in the Pacific War because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But if you're going to abide by a constitution which is designed primarily to protect us against the depredations that could be committed by our government, you've got to understand the concept of limited powers. And once again, historical hypotheticals present some interesting mind games. But you've got to realize, with respect to the domino theory that you were just articulating, that people have a way of standing up to despotism. It is innate within the human character to do so. And the nations of the world are not supinely going to allow somebody like Adolf Hitler, I contend, to go from strength to such a point that we would find ourselves encircled. That was one of the things that FDR was saying by way of preparing the American mind for entry into that war. As a matter of fact, in 1940, he said that Hitler was seeking a new world order, which is an interesting choice of words to describe what Hitler's objectives were, given the most recent usage of the term New World Order with respect to the United Nations. It's a stern discipline, I grant, but it's designed to protect us.
I guess my concern philosophically is, well, I know it is a concern for me, would be that the United States could become isolated and some dictator could take the world and then we'd be so isolated that we would collapse. I wish we could step further, but I must go back to Janelle again.
I want to ask some questions now about the role of women
around
the world. The roles are very disparate depending on, of course, the country that the woman is living in. But in some countries, of course, it's an issue of economics, probably in all countries, basically underlying. What do you consider the role of the UN, or should there be any role with regard to women's, the affairs of women?
Well, once again, to understand the UN's perspective on the issue, I think it's important to recognize that this fall, in September, they're going to be having a World Conference on Women in Beijing, China. It is impossible for me to conceive of a regime which has been less hospitable to women's rights than Communist China. The things that regime does to women should abhor and this should be abhorrent to anybody with any sensibility. The problem with the UN's perspective on the role of women is that they see women as political agents of change, rather than individuals endowed by the Creator with individual rights. And I think that perspective has caused a lot of trouble historically for women and men, for people in general. And one of the major initiatives right now is to find ways of operating in families through the woman when you're talking about the population control designs which were set forth last September in Cairo. Once again, I don't endorse Immanuel Kant's philosophy, but Immanuel Kant made one good point when he said that you should treat people as ends and not as means to an end. And I see the United Nations using women as means to an end, and of course I don't endorse that.
Do you think some of those same programs, though, are viable as a part of the United States, then, if you're saying they're not viable internationally, but we could do some things for women within the United States, or we could do some things for women within China? Well, who's going to do that?
Well, inasmuch as we define a we in any of these enterprises, it should be a we that is not endowed with the power of taxation and the power of the bayonet. In other words, the state shouldn't be involved in it. Once again, there's a wonderful thing to be. There are a lot of wonderful things to be said about voluntary initiatives to help people. I'm all for that. I'm all for having contact and commerce with the world. I just don't think that it's necessary that you have a government broker all these transactions, and the UN comes from a completely different philosophy, which is why I resist it.
So you're saying that if a church wants to,
Sure.
that's an appropriate mechanism to go to China and deal with women's issues in China.
Sure.
And are there any sacred cows, if you will, with regard to feminism? Do you endorse the rights of women, of course, to vote? What other kinds of rights would you endorse?
I don't enumerate rights because in the American concept, you don't enumerate the rights, you enumerate the powers of government, and the rights remain unenumerated. And I believe that women, like men, are given individual rights by their Creator. And I believe that the purpose of our rights is to pursue happiness. So I don't believe that it has anything to do with an ism or with any kind of a collective. I ardently and forthrightly resist and reject all forms of collectivism, including feminism. So.
Unfortunately, we got to notice we only have about 2 minutes left. I wish we had more time. But I would respond with a question of what Janelle's talking about. When you talk about that Constitution enumerates the powers of government and limits, but the Bill of Rights, for example, would be a good case where it enumerates specific rights of individuals like free speech and free press, and you would recognize that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Hamilton wrote in response to the creation of the Bill of Rights? It was created to placate the concerns of the Anti-Federalists because they believed that if you didn't enumerate some rights, that the federal government created by the Constitution would become, well, more or less the kind of federal government we've got right now, which inserts itself into every social transaction. Hamilton said the problem with having a Bill of Rights would be that you would encourage people to believe that unless the right is specified, we wouldn't have it. And that, of course, is a concern that I share.
I'm so sorry we're out of time and I have to bring it to a halt, but thank you, Mr. Norman Gregg, for being with us on the program today.
My pleasure.
And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week at this same time, and we will get into yet another issue that we think that will be of interest to you. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.